It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 34th Brendan Gill Lecture, which will be delivered by Justin McGuirk. Endowed by San Francisco architect Herbert McLaughlin, Yale College, class of 1956, and School of Architecture, 1958, the Gill Lecture Series has a distinguished history, bringing important critics and historians to our school. Previous Gill lecturers have included Wendy Steiner, Esther DaCosta Meyer, David Hickey, Charles Jenks, and Roger Khanna. Kenneth Frampton has twice delivered Gill lectures. The diversity of the roster of Gill lecturers is as it should be, given that Brendan Gill, a class of 1936 in Yale College, was a writer with wide-ranging interests who during a long career was associated with the New Yorker magazine, principally contributing drama criticism and architecture criticism, taking over the Skyline column that had previously been Lewis Mumford's. Last fall, Sylvia Lavin's Gill lecture, Architecture That Is Near and Architecture That Is Far, offered insights into the exhibition Everything Loose Will Land, which was then on view in our gallery, and for which she served as curator. Justin McGuirk, tonight's Gill lecturer, is a graduate of the University of Bristol in England, from which he holds the Bachelor of Arts in the History of Art, and from the Courtauld Institute in London, from which he holds the Master of Arts, also in the History of Art. He's a writer, a critic, and a curator based in London, where he is the director of the Strelka Press, the digital-first imprint of the Strelka Institute for Media, Architecture, and Design in Moscow. Good to be the press in Moscow, good to run it from London, seems to me. A distinguished journalist, Mr. McGuirk has been the design editor for The Guardian, editor-in-chief of Icon magazine, and design consultant to Domus magazine. His writing has also appeared in The Times, The Observer, Art Review, and many other publications. In 2012, in collaboration with Urban Think Tank, he was awarded the Golden Lion at the Venice Biennale of Architecture. I was on the jury, I want to point this out, for the exhibition Torre David Gran Horizonte. Mr. McGuirk's focus is on social architecture and the role of design in network society, as reflected in his recently published book, Radical Cities Across Latin America in Search of a New Architecture. Please join me in welcoming Justin McGuirk to the podium as he delivers the 34th Brendan Gill Lecture.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here and a great privilege as well. And I'd like to thank Dean Stern for inviting me. Let me just get some light here. Well, as Dean Stern just mentioned, I'm going to talk tonight about a book that I wrote very recently called Radical Cities Across Latin America in Search of a New Architecture. I started thinking about this book several years ago when I had been keeping an eye on a generation of architects working in Latin America who I had the impression were finally doing socially conscientious work in places that desperately needed it. When I went to Latin America, I started thinking about architecture. As I said, I was thinking about writing about what I was calling activist architects. But when I started my research, I realized that Latin America has a long history of testing radical ideas in city making. And a book about architecture gradually became a book about cities. Today, everyone's talking about rapid urbanization and quoting scary statistics about the number of millions of people moving into cities in China and India and Africa. We get endlessly quoted this cliche about how 50% of humanity lives in cities. But in Latin America, in many countries, they have 80% urbanization. And in the mid-20th century, those scary statistics were coming out of Latin America. Out of places like this. In Mexico City, this is a housing estate called Nonoalco Tlatelolco. designed in the 1960s by an architect called Mario Panni. Mexico City was a quintessential example of what I'm talking about. It was a city of 1 million people in 1940, on its way to becoming 15 million people by 1980, and over 20 million today. So this housing estate by Panni was designed to hold 100,000 people. And the reason why I cite it isn't partly because it's the largest housing estate of its kind in Latin America, but also because my argument is that this is where the Corbusian idea of the city gets taken to its logical conclusion. Nothing like this, no social housing in Europe or America was built on this scale, not for 100,000 people. And so my argument is that, the Corbusian idea of the city gets built on the scale of the New World in Latin America. And it's also where, Latin America is also where the modernist idea of utopia goes to die. Because by the 1970s, governments realized that they couldn't build mega blocks like this fast enough or cheap enough to keep up with the pace of urbanization. And gradually, from about 1979 onwards, they decide not to, because of a neoliberal politics trickling down from the north, the Washington Consensus, spread by the World Bank and the IMF, which argues that the free market should take over this question of housing. And effectively, architects get removed from the equation of how to house millions of the urban poor, and that becomes more of a social issue. They get replaced by economists and social policy makers, and a kind of laissez-faire urban politics takes hold. And the result, 3 decades later, of that laissez-faire politics is this. This is Caracas today, and what I'm talking about is an absolute explosion of slums that took place through the 1980s and 1990s. And effectively, the segregation of cities into formal and informal. So this is the result of that 3-decade hiatus. This is also the majority experience of most people moving into cities in the global south, where most urban development is happening today. And UN Habitat thinks that by 2030, 2 billion people will be living in slums around the world at that time. That's a quarter of humanity at that stage. And so the book picks up this story after this kind of long period of neglect in the late 1990s, when, arguably there is a shift from what had been a kind of utopian idealism in the modernist period to something different, to something more sensitive, more pragmatic, dealing with the scale of this new problem. Of course, I was naive, and I realized quite quickly that that utopian idealism I was talking about wasn't quite so utopian, especially in Latin America. And so a lot of these social housing projects were not, were not in fact quite what they might have been. Here's an example in Buenos Aires, in the south, a housing estate called Piedra Buena, designed by a major Buenos Aires practice of the time, by famous people like Sanchez Gomez and Solsona. But the project architect on this was a young Uruguayan called Rafael Viñoly, who went on to become the most successful commercial architect of his generation in Latin America. Today he's building one of the biggest and, in my opinion, one of the ugliest buildings in London. And that shift from this kind of thing to that kind of thing is absolutely paradigmatic, I think, of what has happened to the architecture profession in many ways. The only reason why I show this building, I'm not going to dwell on it, is because Viñoly did imbue this with the necessary idealism at the time, as much as he could have. And there were interesting architectural experiments going on in this building. The reason I show it is simply because it was symptomatic of many of the problems of housing estates across Latin America, which was that it wasn't used to house the people being evicted from the slums, which was its original purpose, and it was built by military dictatorship who used it to buy votes from the military and the police, etc. And it was also, these house building programs were also a way of feeding credit lines to the construction companies and driving a tremendous amount of corruption, etc. That's one problem with it. The other problem, of course, is that they were located often on the periphery of cities, hours away from people's jobs, etc. They were disconnected, they weren't maintained properly, and eventually they were kind of ghettoized. They fell into disrepair. So I asked myself if this kind of paternalistic approach to housing had a very checkered history in Latin America and was often ethically dubious. Was there a more idealistic bottom-up approach that didn't result in a slum? And I found a case in the north of Argentina following stories of an extraordinary woman who apparently was building houses faster than the private housing sector could in the north there, up by the Bolivian border near Jujuy, in Jujuy. And I'd heard stories of her building swimming pools and so on, and it all sounded incredibly idealistic. This is the lady with the microphone. Her name's Milagro Sala, and she is the leader of a revolutionary socialist movement called Tupac Amaru. And the reason why she's interesting is because she took government funds to build housing, which is what a lot of politicians in that area were doing and not building housing with. She took that housing, and instead of, she took the money, and instead of building housing, she started to build factories for building materials, and she started to employ the local community to build their own houses. And what she did effectively was create a system that provided all kinds of things, not just units, but employment, a sense of community and empowerment. And also when I got there, I realized that these swimming pools, which I'd imagined as kind of, oblong little things, were actually more like kind of aquatic parks with, on a vast scale with, interesting figurines around the poolside. And generally what she had tried to create there, what she called this community, which its name is Alto Comedero, but what they call it is the country club, because it has, playgrounds and a Jurassic theme park and football pitches and all manner of sports fields everywhere. And I'm telling you this simply because you may not find the architecture terribly compelling. I mean, it's very simple row housing, standard issue from the government. But what she's doing is she's kind of reversing the usual equation of social housing, which is normally about providing the minimum that you can get away with for people. She's trying to provide the maximum that you can provide with the available government funds. And the interesting thing is that a swimming pool is a very cheap way of making poor people feel rich. So what she does is she gets people to build their own houses, then they get given those houses, and the houses come branded with, the face of Che Guevara or Eva Perón or whoever it might be, one of their kind of, their iconography of socialist revolutionary heroes. And effectively what this place is, in my opinion, is a radical socialist Disney theme park urbanism. But it is exceptional because, for several reasons, it cuts out all the middlemen. It doesn't rely on construction companies or indeed even architects. It's not a market-driven approach to housing. It doesn't, as I said, create units. It creates employment and community. And it effectively operates outside the standard neoliberal capitalist framework that governs most house building today. Of course, this self-organized approach to community building has a long history. And it starts to be celebrated in the 1960s, the early 1960s, by an English architect called John Turner, who spends years investigating in Peru the barrios there, which are called the barriadas. And Turner comes up with a very controversial argument, which is that, in fact, these communities are deeply empowering to people, that they actually serve their purposes much better in many ways than the modernist social housing being built out in the periphery, because for one thing, they're closer to where their jobs and social networks are. They can, when their family grows, they can expand their houses as they need to. And if there's one thing you can't do in a modernist housing block, it's expand your apartment. And so he comes up with this term, housing as a verb, which is really the expression of that idea that housing is what it does for you, not how it looks. And that idea, by the way, it becomes a kind of cause célèbre. Charles Jenks puts it on his map of modernism, the barriadas, right there next to the metabolists. And it becomes the basis for a competition in Peru in the late 60s, started by an English architect called Peter Land. And there's an architect as president of Peru at the time, Belaunde, and they hold this housing competition, which is like a housing Olympics. They invite many of the greatest architects of the day, the best avant-garde architects of the day anyway, James Sterling, Aldo van Eyck, Charles Correa, Christopher Alexander, the Metabolists, Candilis Josic Woods. It's a kind of who's who of the new generation of late modernists at that stage. And the idea for the competition is low-rise, high-density housing. These are based on the barriada model, where people will be able to expand them over time. And they hold this huge housing competition, and the idea is they're going to choose one model, and they're going to roll it out in the thousands. It's one-story houses which people can then expand. In the end, they don't quite do that. They choose to build, they test all the competition entries on one site, about 500 houses, about 20 houses per design. And it's a great experiment. I mean, this is kind of, first of all, we have to say, this is the last time that some of the greatest architects in the world unite to tackle the question of social housing, 1968. It's also, in a sense, it's also architecture's last chance to try and come up with a solution to housing the world's urban poor. And it fails because a couple of reasons. It was so expensive to do it that the military government that came in kind of pulled the plug on it. It never got rolled out at the scale that it was meant to, and it was kind of forgotten about. It was it's in a way one of the great lost projects, lost modernist projects. And what happens over 30 years as it's forgotten and people just get on with doing what they were supposed to do there is it transforms. So this is a house by Charles Correa, or it was, the ground floor was a house by Charles Correa, which gets expanded. Like all of the houses there, the original designs are just like the kernel inside a popcorn, which is just kind of popped. These are the James Sterling houses, recognizable by their porthole windows, expanded in the most simple way, really. But some residents go wild, and this is an Aldo van Eyck house, which becomes a kind of, I don't know, a kind of bourgeois suburban ideal of what a house should be. Probably that person became fairly, well off after some time. The family grew, and the thing about Prevey is that people stayed. People invested in that neighborhood and looked after these little Aldo van Eyck gardens in between. And the streetscape is rather extraordinary because it's so diverse. There are so many different housing typologies on one site, and it's all very walkable, and there are lots of alleys and gardens and so on. And it's kind of an extraordinary place, and it's being rediscovered, in fact. And the other thing is that, Jenks, who was mentioned earlier, cites the end of modernism as 1972 with the blowing up of Pruitt-Igoe. That wasn't quite the case in Latin America, where they continued that building social housing for some time. But you could argue that there's a case to be made that Prevey is also one of those moments where modernism threatens to evolve into something else, something less dogmatic, more adaptive, more evolutionary, but it doesn't happen. It gets forgotten about. But the idea gets picked up 40 years later in Chile with a project that I'm sure you all know in the north, in Iquique, designed by an architect called Alejandro Aravena and a practice called Elemental. And here it comes with a really brutally reductive logic. The idea being that if you haven't got enough money to build everyone in the community a house, you build everybody half a house. You build the half that they can't do for themselves, the structure, the kitchen, the bathroom, etc. And you leave a void for them to expand into over time. It is the Prevey principle in some way, although in a much more kind of reduced design language, of course. And what happens is that people expand, with whatever they have to hand or with whatever style they particularly, fancy. The streetscape becomes fairly unpredictable, alternating between these very rigid kind of concrete blocks and a very individualistic kind of fanciful styling. So I struggled with this project a little bit in encountering it, because it is many things. I mean, it does provide what, in some senses, what Prevey provided, that the possibility to expand, to participate in the process. As John Turner says, housing is a verb. So it enables people to be in control. It treats housing as a platform. I wondered, though, whether it was too pragmatic, because I found myself wrestling with the idea of whether people should have to, hard-working, working-class people, whether they should have to spend their weekends and evenings building the rest of their home, and wouldn't they prefer just to have a whole house? I wondered whether it was good urbanism. It certainly works at a small scale, but if you roll it out at scale, does it become not the modernist monoculture, but a kind of duoculture? Anyway, I mean, my concerns were kind of irrelevant, because what happens in Chile over a few years after that project is that the housing budget keeps going up. Chile is a fairly rich, probably the richest per capita country in Latin America, and eventually Aravena is producing this kind of thing, which is standard housing, which originally is supposed to be expanded inside, so people would add their own floors inside and expand not externally but internally. In the end, they didn't even need to do that because they had enough money to complete the houses. And Aravena found this terribly frustrating. He wanted to see people, involved in the process. He wanted to see that reflected on the facade, etc. But anyway, the point is that it's a radical idea, this idea that you build half a house, and it's too radical for Chile, which doesn't need it. Chile's too rich. But it still has potential in cities across the developing world, I would argue, at least to be tested at scale. And there are cities with, Chile doesn't have a particular slum problem, but there are cities that do, like Rio. Rio has its own history of radical urban design proposals, of course. This is Le Corbusier's 1929 proposal that the city effectively becomes one long ribbon, a kind of wall of housing, which then goes on to become Alfonso Reyes Pedregullo housing, which is also a kind of ribbon. But it's not really that kind of idea that I want to dwell on in Rio, in fact, because when people often coming across, finding out that I'm writing a book about, or was writing a book about Latin American cities, radical cities, they said, oh, Brasilia, you must be writing about Brasilia. Well, in fact, no, because radical though it was at the time, it actually is not the most, for me, successful form of city. Neither is this, the slums of Complexo do Alemão in Rio, but it is radical because the slums are a mechanism, whatever we think of them, for absorbing millions of people into the city and offering them some of the opportunities that cities hold. Of course, and Rio is an important cog in this story because Rio is the birthplace of the favela. And of course, favelas come with tremendous privations, but they also have certain qualities, and they are also on a scale that nobody had quite anticipated in Turner's day when they were celebrating this kind of thing, and when governments were using Turner's argument to, neglect their responsibilities, arguably. Rio is important because it's the site of a major U-turn in urban policy and a major shift in attitude towards the favelas, where they're no longer treated as sites of illegality that have to be kind of erased and replaced with a proper city or with proper planning. And a certain kind of shift takes place from one medical metaphor to another. Instead of cutting out the cancer of the slum, we shift to urban acupuncture. This idea that you can kind of stimulate the nervous system of the city with key interventions. And Rio pioneers this idea in the 1990s with a program called Favela Bairro, where they start to realize that they need to break down the barriers between the informal and the formal city. And that's like physical barriers, social barriers, psychological barriers. And they start to do that, first of all, by retrofitting them with key infrastructure, drainage, running water, sanitation systems. And also with little moments of public space like this. There was a sense that somehow the favela lacked urbanity in the classic in the kind of classic Western model. That's controversial now because, of course, some argue that the favela has its own quality that should be preserved, that public space in the kind of European model is not necessary if the street is public space, but that's a debate. And most importantly, transport, of course, is needed to connect the informal and the formal city. So Rio, in the late 90s and early 2000s, is pioneering this effort. And it becomes highly influential in Colombia and in other countries around the world. But I argue that it starts to go wrong in recent years with the winning of the World Cup and the Olympics. This is Manguinhos in Rio, one of the worst favelas. And an architect who was really instrumental in the Favela Bairro program, a guy called Jorge Mario Jauregui, comes up with this great plan to reconnect this barrio by lifting up that that railway that was on the left and cutting it off from the rest of the city. But the whole process gets kind of mired in politics and in bureaucracy, and they start evicting people and demolishing houses. Then they stop, and they leave people in limbo. And it's one of the kind of fairly tragic consequences of politics in Rio today, where, you know, evictions become a political hot potato, so projects just get stalled. And the key thing that starts to go wrong in Rio, I argue, is that there's this massive influx of money, but it's all being used in questionable ways. So the World Cup, FIFA and the World Cup have their particular demands. The International Olympic Committee have their particular demands. The politicians have their interests, and the construction companies have their interests, and the developers have their interests. And instead of doing what, for example, London did, putting the Olympics facilities in the poorest part of the city to regenerate that part, they actually locate them in one of the richest parts out in the west. And so they start channeling, you know, key transport networks out to where they can build, you know, condominium developments, etc. And the project starts to go, I argue that this kind of idealistic project of trying to integrate the slums back into the city, to accept them as real parts of the city, real functioning, productive parts of the city, starts to get derailed. And I'm not the only one to notice this, of course. Millions of people took to the streets in Brazil, and 1 million people in Rio alone last year. And these people want to know why they can't have FIFA standard hospitals, why they can't have FIFA standard education and public services. And I would argue that at this particular moment, with the problems that it faces, Rio is fighting for the soul of the city, because they forgot to ask the question in sloshing around all this money for the Olympics and the World Cup of who is the city for. And some of that money could have been used in a far more equitable manner. The other place that has been experiencing demonstrations recently is Caracas. We saw this image earlier, but it's instructive, so I'll show it again. And there it's more like a middle-class uprising against the Bolivarian revolution, which is finally starting to unravel. But Caracas went through a similar process to other Latin American cities, beginning with the superblock experiment. This is 23 de Enero, a 1950s housing block, at the time the largest of its kind in Latin America, built again by a military dictator. But Latin America does strange things to these. I mean, it's really a continent that creates hybrids. And so the formal blocks become, in the end, a kind of framework for a giant barrio that fleshes out the bones around it. And my focus here in Caracas in the research is a practice called urban think tank, who epitomize, in the beginning at least, that attitude of urban acupuncture, where you can make significant difference in a community with key moments of intervention, often with quite humble origins. So, for example, a community wants you to build a roof over a football pitch so that their kids can play football when it's raining, and instead, Urban Think Tank proposes a 3-story gym with suspended running track and 24/7 facilities for the community, whether it's dancing, tai chi, football. You can still, of course, play football on the roof. And so this kind of very dense programmed intervention on quite a small site has a huge impact, of course, and crime drops 30% in that particular barrio. And then they start to build several of these around the city. Six or seven of them were in construction at some point. I think about 3 of them have been finished by this time. Things are moving very slowly in Caracas at the moment. Much more significantly, they build the most important legacy of the Chavez era, perhaps one of the only significant urban legacies of the Chavez era, which is that cable car. You can see the station on the top of the hill there in the slum of San Agustin. And what's important here in the story is the way this comes about, because Urban Think Tank effectively initiates this process, suggesting to the government this is what they should do, and making it happen. It's that kind of process of lobbying the government and making it happen that is that characterizes what I'm calling the activist architect. It's the very act of self-initiation which makes it a form of activist architecture. There's no one calling them up or asking them to do this. There's no competition. It's simply a slow process of persuasion and lobbying. And this is important because, you know, the journey, this is very close to the city center, but the journey to the top of that hill took an hour by foot up a set of concrete steps, and now it takes 15 minutes. And if you think about that twice a day at least, it's a kind of transformational shift in people's quality of lives. Of course, with everything in Venezuela, it comes with its own kind of socialist branding. The cable cars here are called Inclusión and Libertad, which is no bad thing. And I show this slide of urban think tanks, Alfredo Brienberg playing basketball with some street kids in that particular favela for one reason only, which is that this conception of the architect and their role in these communities is slightly different from the way, arguably, architecture is often practiced. The activist architect is an extrovert or nothing at all, because the primary role, in a way, is to be a social connector, to connect the people in those communities with the power, public finance, and public strategic planning at the top. It's a question of going into those communities to figure out what they need, to get them involved in the process, and to get their voices heard by the power at the top, by public authorities. So, I mean, I want to make a small point about self-organization. It's interesting how people read the book, and some see it as an absolute celebration of self-organizing principles. I have to say, I think self-organization has its limits, very clear limits. I was at a conference recently where someone was talking about a situation in Cairo where people had built themselves an access ramp to a ring road, and she was describing it as the wiki city. And to me, it sounds like a disaster, because that is the absolute abdication of public responsibility. It's not for people to build themselves transport infrastructure. I think, you know, as we've seen from the slums in Latin America, people can build themselves their own communities, but they cannot build themselves a transport network. But Caracas throws up other strange phenomena as well, and I'd like to spend a moment on this one. Torre David, the 45-story skyscraper that was, until quite recently, squatted by between 3,000 and 5,000 people. Stuart Brand once said that all buildings are predictions and all predictions are wrong. And this particular building was a failed prediction because it was planned in the 1990s as a corporate skyscraper, a kind of banking headquarters, except that the developer died and the economy crashed, and it was in limbo, semi-finished for 10 years. Then in 2007, when there was a massive flood and there were thousands of people left homeless, it started to be occupied, and gradually it was squatted up to the 28th story. The extraordinary thing about this is that it's right in the center of Caracas in the financial district. And the question on those people's minds probably was, why should millions of people live in the slums around the periphery of the city? And let's understand that 40% of Caracas lives in those slums. Why should millions of people live in those slums when there are empty skyscrapers in the city center? Chavez, of course, encouraged this kind of thinking with his demagogic speech-making, encouraging people to occupy derelict property or even golf courses, not supporting them with legal apparatuses, with, not giving them the legal backing, but basically giving them a kind of tacit understanding that nothing would happen if they did occupy these spaces. And so, of course, they started to do that. And they, in my opinion, took a dead skeleton and brought it life, they took a failed financial speculation and gave it some kind of social purpose as a temporary commons, if you like. So this is the what would have been the gilded corporate atrium, and is now the place where they hold their community meetings and manage the self-organization of the building. I have to explain that people brought in their own electricity, which they paid for, and they installed their own water supply systems, and they organized the allotting and managing of the apartments and cleaning up the public spaces and everything. So it is actually a fairly well-run, well-managed building, despite many claims to the contrary, and many people saying it's a kind of den of crime, which is simply not true. I mean, there are 3,000 to 5,000 people, maybe a handful were criminals in the beginning. The rest are simply ordinary, desperate people. There was an episode of Homeland which purported to be filmed in this tower, which portrayed it as just that, a hive of kind of crime and drugs, which is simply Hollywood fantasy. Of course, the drawback is that skyscrapers only exist because of the invention of the elevator, and this is a 45-story skyscraper with no elevator. People don't actually use this external staircase, I hasten to add. I'm showing it because it reminds me of Le Corbusier's drawing of the domino house, which is that two concrete slab drawing with the concrete stair on the outside. And I've argued before that this is effectively a 45-story domino house, an open structure, which people can kind of inhabit in whatever way suits their needs. And people inside are trying to live the semblance of a normal life. I mean, this is, again, someone... This is someone's idea of a kind of normal middle-class existence, or it's his aspiration to that idea of a normal middle-class existence. The thing about these kind of housing environments and slums in general is that they're defined by risk. So, in the beginning you start with very humble materials, cardboard and so on, not because you're that poor, and not because you can't afford bricks, because you don't know if you can invest in those materials, because you don't know if you're going to be kicked off the land in the next year or so. Once you establish a certain security on the land, then you can invest. And so this is someone who took the plunge and said, we're going to be here for the duration. This is the gym on the 28th floor. So he's 2 feet away from a 28-story drop, of course. And I say that to make clear that I'm not romanticizing this building. It's a building with clear problems, especially for, given that there are children in there. But it is an extraordinary symbol in many ways. It's, first of all, a symbol of financial capital turned into a symbol of social capital. That's one thing. It's also an urban laboratory in many ways, because this has a kind of authentic smell of the future to me, this building. We don't quite know what's going to happen with all of the speculative tower blocks that we're throwing up by the thousands every year. We know that often they're built without the necessary, that there's a glut of these things in many cities without the necessary demand. And if that occurs, if the property bubble bursts in a situation like that, and there are millions of people living in slums on the edges, we are likely to see this kind of thing again. And so what we were trying to do with Urban Think Tank was to kind of study it, understand its systems, and see if there was a way of making it socially and environmentally sustainable. The experiment has now come to an end, it seems, because the government at first claimed to have sold the building to some Chinese financiers who were going to turn it back into a banking headquarters. But that seems to be untrue, as there have been all kinds of rumors about them demolishing it or them turning it into a hotel for the working class. It remains to be seen. I'd like to talk about a very different approach to the city through this man. He was the mayor of Bogota in the late 90s, twice. His name's Antanas Mockus, and he was a philosophy professor, dean of the university in Bogota. And he came to prominence in a very strange way. He was faced one day with an unruly auditorium full of students, and the way he handled it was by going to the edge of the stage, pulling down his trousers and showing them his behind. And he called that an act of symbolic violence, and it did change his relationship with the students. It also got him fired. And in the kind of public outcry about this kind of behavior by a dean of the university, he became a kind of public figure. People were suddenly interested in what he had to say, and he ran for mayor, and he won with a landslide. And he's extraordinary. He's an extraordinary character because he did one very key thing, which is that he proved you can change a city without building anything. And, as we know, mayors like to cut ribbons. They like to leave physical legacies. And Mockus wasn't in the position to do that when he took over Bogota. Bogota, by the way, in the late 90s was a mess. It had real problems with crime, with traffic fatalities, with the privatization of public space, and generally with the kind of unruly nature of its citizenry who, a certain kind of chaos had taken hold, let's say. And Mockus's idea was that he would intervene in the civic DNA of the city by changing people's behavior. He started doing this through really unorthodox policies, like firing the traffic police and replacing them with mime artists. His reasoning here was that, the reason why he fired the traffic police was because they were so corrupt. And citizens aren't going to change their behavior if they're given a ticket by a corrupt authority figure. But they might start to think about what they're doing if they're forced to through comedy, through humor, through being embarrassed by mimes mimicking them, jaywalking in the street, and so on. And it proved to be incredibly successful, and so he rolled this out across the city temporarily. And he did other things, like he printed hundreds of thousands of red cards, like the ones that referees use on the soccer pitch to send people off. And he distributed them among the citizens so that if you saw another person driving selfishly or dangerously, you showed them the red card. And again, the logic is that if you're told not to do that by a corrupt authority figure, you're not going to pay any attention. But if you're shamed by a fellow citizen, that's likely to change the way you think about how you're behaving. And Marcus did all kinds of extraordinary things. I mean, he held amnesties for guns, and he had thousands of weapons were handed in, and they were melted down into spoons that said, "I used to be a gun." And all of these kind of policies. And the thing is that, laugh though we do, they were incredibly successful. Homicide rates by the end of his second term had fallen by 70%. Traffic fatalities fell by 50%. Water usage fell by 40%. And he tripled tax revenues by persuading the rich to pay more if they wanted to. He didn't tell them they had to, he just persuaded them. And the reason why this is interesting is because there were more famous mayors after him, like Enrique Peñalosa, who did extraordinary things as well, again, with public transport. One of the key lessons of the book is public transport. And Peñalosa brings in Transmilenio, dedicated bus lanes, bike lanes, pavements. It's all good stuff, socially equalizing stuff. But he always looks ordinary compared to Marcus to me, because Marcus just thinks completely differently. He's always kind of unorthodox and challenging in his thinking. And he proves that you can change the city through behavior, leaving no tangible legacy. He said something really great, which is that if you can't change the hardware, change the software. And he had a huge impact on elsewhere in Colombia, changing the political climate, really, because he was the first politically independent mayor. And he paved the way for others. For example, in Medellin, this is Medellin, the second city, which in the 1990s was the murder capital of the world. It was in the grip of the warring drug cartels, and it was literally being bathed in blood, a murder rate that has hardly ever been seen since. And eventually, people get sick of this bloodbath, and they elect a new mayor called Sergio Fajardo at the head of a new civic movement. And they initiate what they call social urbanism, which is the collaboration, really, of several aspects of society, the politicians with the architects, with the business community and the citizens. And they start to transform the city through public buildings and public spaces. The idea is that partly they're trying to kind of raise a level of civic pride and return a sense of normality to the city, create places where people can go, civilized places where people can go, get kids off the street and all of these kind of things. And there are all kinds of buildings like this. This is the canopy in the Botanical Gardens, lots of beautiful structures. Most famously, there's this library in this barrio on the hilltop in Medellin. And all of this stuff was very widely published. But I think, what's key is not to lose sight of the real message here, because this is an iconic building in a book that's very much not about iconic buildings. And I would argue that it's appropriate for this building to be iconic because it does one key thing. It makes that slum visible. We're talking about large parts of the city that no one ever went, that many people pretended just kind of didn't exist. And by putting these new crown jewels in the poorest parts of the city, they're effectively making them valuable parts of the city and making them visible again, making them, drawing attention to them. But architecture aside, what comes alongside these kind of interventions is, first of all, transport links. They build cable cars up to the slums, which are incredibly popular. They did a survey recently that said, ask citizens, would they rather give up their cell phones or their cable car? And they said their cell phones. All of this is also the kind of physical manifestation of an investment in education. So they're mainly library buildings and school buildings and parks. And the other extraordinary thing is the way that they paid for it, which is that Medellin has a municipal energy company, EPM. Now, in America and Europe, we're used to the privatization of natural resources, but this, the fact that they have a municipal energy company means that they could feed that company could feed hundreds of millions of dollars into the city coffers every year so they could fund this incredible transformation. And the result years later was extraordinary. I mean, the crime levels just dropped in an extreme way. They also did other strange experiments, like building this escalator up the slum of Comuna 13. Comuna 13 it was so violent that the military tried to take it back a few years earlier, and they failed. They were outgunned. So, I mean, we're used to seeing escalators in shopping malls and in airports, but we're not used to seeing them up slum-ridden hillsides. And these are the kind of experiments that Latin America throws up consistently. But the lesson of Medellin is really, it's not about, as I said, it's not about architecture. It's about the kind of social makeup. It's about the social structures that go that come into place to create that architecture in the first place that are much more valuable. And it's been, the lesson of Medellin, as many of you will know, has been incredibly instructive and influential around the world. Finally, the book ends here at the US-Mexican border at Tijuana. And I start to ask the question whether there are any lessons of the informal city, or even the attempts to bring the informal city back into the fold in Latin America that have application in the north, in the economic north. I mean, this borderline here that we see running into the sea is a line that the San Diego architect Teddy Cruz calls the political equator, because it's a line that does effectively run right around the world, dividing the economic north from the global south. The global south being where most urban growth is happening this century and where tremendous urban inequality is happening. So Teddy Cruz has been investigating this area for some time, and I mean, you can see the distinction quite clearly here in this image of this highway and the border wall cutting off Mexico on one side, Mexico, which is a slum, on one side, and America, which is this nature preserve, on the other side. And he starts to realize that these communities along the border are what he calls 100% productive. In other words, they're not consuming things in the way that we do, but they are using recycled goods to make their communities. Like this, these are houses built out of garage doors from San Diego, and foundation walls built up out of tires, again from San Diego, and sometimes whole track houses come down on the back of trucks across the border, and they're propped on top of each other with these space frames in a way that Cruz calls club sandwich urbanism. But the real lesson he arrives at from these communities is really about land use, not about buildings. What's so productive about the informal city is the way that so many different forms of activity can happen in the same area. We are used to a much more rigid idea of planning and zoning in the economic north, but there is a certain kind of energy that comes out of that loose regulation of zoning in the informal city that can be instructive. And Cruz said something that I think is very interesting. He said, we need a new concept of density. Density is still measured as a number of things, units per acre. Why not measure it as a number of social and economic exchanges per acre? And I would say that that's the lesson of the informal city. It's a certain kind of complexity that allows people to open a shop in their front room or a restaurant in their front room or use the street as a market. And that's certainly very different from the way zoning and urbanism works, say, just across the border in San Diego, in one of the richest areas of the world. And, the book ends on this kind of amazing moment where finally Teddy Cruz gets brought into City Hall. There's a Democratic mayor called Bob Filner. Teddy Cruz gets given, carte blanche to set up his own institute, the Civic Imagination Hub, and he's going to start testing this kind of micro-zoning in San Isidro, a neighborhood in San Diego. And the idea is that you slice up the plots of land into these kind of micro-zones where you can have housing and a market and a cultural center and a hotel and all kinds, and an old people's home, all occupying the same kind of plot. So you can kind of maximize the amount of social and economic exchanges in one small area. This is very different, of course, from the kind of rigid separation of working life and living that is commonplace across the Western world ever since the Industrial Revolution. It doesn't quite go according to plan because Bob Filner gets done for sexual harassment and he's fired, and then there's an election and a Republican comes in and pulls the plug on the whole project. But what's interesting is that these Latin American lessons are starting to cohere now, and Cruz is now collaborating with Marcos in Tijuana to start solving some of their problems. And there is this sense that Latin America, over the last 15 years, has developed this tremendous toolbox of ideas. And what this book is, and it is, aside from the occasional dark note, it is an incredibly optimistic book that aims to be a kind of toolbox for cities looking to address the question of extreme urban inequality. And I'm going to leave it there, but I'm going to say that, 6 months after, a year after having finished writing this book, it started to occur to me, what is what I was documenting the beginning of something or the end of something? It's very unclear whether those projects will start to germinate in other places, whether they'll proceed, in a still more progressive and experimental manner, or whether it's already history. And it felt very current when I was writing it. Now I wonder whether it's history. And I don't know, this is something open for discussion, but I'd like to thank you very much and leave it there for now and hope we can have some questions.
Thank you for a very stimulating, interesting talk. It's something that doesn't exactly come down our pike so regularly, so that's great. I'm sure there are some questions from people in the audience. I hope there are. Oh, yes, way up. Is that Sunil? No. Who is that? Oh,
Hi,
okay.
Thanks for the talk.
All guys with long hair back there, look alike.
I guess I'd like to touch on that last point you gave as to if this is maybe an end or a beginning of sorts, and maybe get your thoughts on maybe one of, I guess I picked up on 3 main roles that sort of architects are playing out in some of these examples. The first being sort of responding to the need that is, say, coming from top down, is to build more housing. The second is maybe a need that isn't necessarily asked for, which is like the infrastructure project of Urban Think Tank. Or then maybe leaving the architect out, as in the Torre David example. Just wondering what your thoughts are as to sort of the maybe most promising future.
Okay, which mic is working here? That's a good and rich question. I think that it's not as simple as housing anymore. In many of those cases, in many of those cities, you're not really dealing with a housing problem, because the favelas, whatever we may think of them, are housing. And people, as I said, are fully capable of building their own housing. Maybe not to the quality that we in this room would like to see or could do, but they do have houses. And within those houses, they have many of the things that we have. They have a pretty high standard of consumer appliance, to be honest. They're using computers with Facebook, and they have Xboxes, some of them, especially in places like Venezuela, where the inflation is so high that they have to spend the money quickly on goods, because otherwise it's not worth anything. So they have many of the things we have. What they don't have is infrastructure. So the key thing they're missing is transport. They're missing, sewerage, drainage, running water often. Not always, but often. And that's the great challenge, I think, of the segregated city today. It's obviously so much more difficult to retrofit those things when you've got such dense communities. And that's why these cable cars, by the way, are incredibly popular, because if you had to put a road through those hillsides, you'd be evicting hundreds of, if not thousands of people. But if you just have to put a few pylon feet in the ground, it's much less disruptive, and that's why it became such a kind of trope across Latin America. It's like the kind of politically acceptable face of eviction. So I'm arguing that architects have a kind of slightly different role, in fact, in that equation. It's not about necessarily building houses, although I still believe and firmly believe we need to build more social housing. It's much more about being this kind of social connector, helping people get the infrastructure that they need, and that is not some kind of, you know, logistical or technocratic or engineering service. I mean, really, often it does come down to real spatial solutions. I mean, what this book is about in many ways is the return of spatial solutions to the problems of urban poverty and urban segregation. As I said at the beginning, for 30 years, politicians thought that those problems could be solved through economics, through economic handouts and redistribution policies. It didn't work. And so architects are coming back in to try and bring space and design back as a tool of politics.
There's a question, right?
Thank you. So this strikes me as being something of like a progressive movement of the global South, and you know, we had our progressivism in the United States, in England, in the beginning of the 20th century, and there the sort of, while the rhetoric was one of improving the quality of life, what really got achieved was an integration of more people's actions into the formal economy. And I'm wondering whether there's a possibility for radical cities that accumulate in a different direction. It seems like, you know, infrastructures, what they do is they pull people into the formal city, the formal economic relations of production. And I wonder if there's a way of theorizing radical cities that maybe accumulate in a different direction so that they don't follow the same trajectory that the global North has.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. Very difficult to answer, of course, but yes, I mean, is it as simple as, for example, giving them property rights, making them pay taxes, and turning them into into ordinary citizens in the way that we are? I mean, many people argue that it is that simple. Hernando de Soto, the Peruvian economist, argues just that you need to give people property rights to make them able to capitalize on their assets. I think that it's much more complicated than that. I think it really depends on where we're talking about. There's no blanket solution here. So an extraordinary thing started to happen in the last few years, where it emerged that Europeans from Southern Europe, in fact, Italy and Portugal and Spain, were moving into some of the favelas in Rio, which 10 years ago would have been totally unthinkable, and it only happened because of this very aggressive policy of so-called pacification in the slums. But the net effect is that it began a process of kind of gentrification, and it made people realize, well, what they always did realize, in fact, was that some of these slums, especially along the beaches in Rio, are incredibly in very dramatic locations, and Europeans were going there because it was safe now and beautiful and dramatic and cheap. And of course, that opens the door to to the market. And that's not necessarily any bad thing, but if those people had property rights at this particular point in time, what would happen is that they would sell their houses at what would still be a very cheap rate, and they would unwittingly evict themselves from the center of the city by going and buying something, you know, out on the edge, for example, and having a bit of spending money. I mean, that would totally be their right, but the net effect would be the expulsion of the poor from the center of the city, and a kind of ring of poverty. At the moment, the poor are kind of, unlike Sao Paulo, the poor are kind of woven through the middle of the city. I think this is very complicated because there's no way of saying that without sounding incredibly patronizing, that people that people can't look after their own interests. Of course they can, but the market is absolutely ruthless. There's no way, I mean, a developer will make them a small offer that they can't refuse, and eventually those favelas would be skyscrapers. However, on the outskirts of the city, where that land is not as in demand, I think absolutely give people property rights and let them capitalize on their assets. In the center, I would say where land is most valuable and you want to keep a certain working class population in the city to provide valuable services, maybe a social renting system would be more valuable. I don't know if I've answered your question. But.
Deborah? Wait a second, let's get a mic. Here it comes.
I thought that was absolutely superb, and thank you. But it's the lecture of a true historian, which was delightfully non-anecdotal or non-personally anecdotal, which leads me to the inevitable question, which is a personal one, which is whether the physical experience you had of any of those places that you went to, the spaces, the objects, the people using them, changed how you thought that straight research wouldn't have done?
Interesting. Because, of course, what I'm kind of arguing is that, in a way, the physical experience of some of those buildings is perhaps less important than the fact that they exist at all. And, I mean, like I said, when I showed that picture of an architect playing basketball with some street kids,
Columbia-trained architect playing basketball.
Columbia-trained.
Former student of the dean.
A Columbia-trained architect, pretending to be a man of the people.
Exactly.
Quite successfully. What I'm arguing is that there are really not just basic, but urgent needs. And I'm kind of saying that the role of the architect in that situation is to be this kind of instigator, to be the initiator of a process that they then see through. But it's not always about, it's not about rarefied form. So what happens to Urban Think Tank several times is that they design these very nice buildings, often riffing off a kind of, archigram-esque aesthetic, a kind of 60s pop aesthetic. Like that vertical gym is very kind of Latin American high-tech in a strange way. But what happens is that the buildings always become something else. I mean, it's very difficult to control that process. And it's you precisely cannot be precious about the fact that the builder ignored your drawings of plexiglass and used brick instead. Because as long as the result serves, maybe it's not as beautiful as it was supposed to be, but if it's serving the right purpose, then that's the important thing. I'm not sure if I've interpreted your question in the correct way, but I'm trying to say that it's not so much about being precious about form or detailing, although if one can enforce those aspects, as you all want to in your careers, then that's ideal.
Deborah, are you satisfied?
It answered a different question.
Okay, well, let's try again.
What I was really trying to get at was whether the physical experience for you changed what you thought. You, as an art historian, a man trained in looking at objects, I'm drawn to, believe me, for many reasons, the argument you're making, but I'm trying to get at a more personal nugget of it, is when you were standing in some of those places, did it change how you thought?
Absolutely, yes. Because, I mean, that was, in a way, one of the key motives for doing this book, is that a lot of that stuff, as you know, has been published, often quite widely. Probably most widely published is that Aravena project. And people were making extraordinary claims for it. And quite rightly, because, as a mathematical equation, it is kind of extraordinary. But when you go there, it's depressing. It's depressing mainly for one reason, because it's so far away. And then when you get there, you realize that it's not the pyramids. It's like, it's some really cheap housing. And then I think the whole impetus for the book was not just about seeing things in person, but talking to the people that live there. And the book is really kind of full of these conversations with the people who occupy these places. And you just find out extraordinary things about them, about the way public space is, shared space is used or not used, the kind of problems with neighbors, and how easy it is for people to build their houses. And yes, so being there was very much the whole point of the research. I don't think it would be a worthless book if I hadn't made the journey to each of these places. And let alone Torre David. I mean, there's no way I could have understood or appreciated that building without having spent 5 days in there. No way.
Alan Plattis?
This is a bit of a sidebar, but it occurred to me that there's another theme that was running through your remarks, which were terrific, and that also connect to what somebody was asking about earlier, the parallel with progressive era urbanism in North America and Europe. And that is the association of so many of these projects with charismatic leadership, which is a very old tradition in Latin America, and one with rather mixed stories. And I'm aware of some of these projects in Brazil and other places that have started with great fanfare and have never been completed and are just sitting there as useless ruins of infrastructure. And there's often that political story behind it, of patronage, of pandering to groups of voters, and then either being pushed out or walking away from those obligations. Is there real social capital being built that is sustainable? And is there a distinction to be made in terms of process, but I mean design process, between those things that are the top-down toys and gifts of charismatic politicians and the things that are really building indigenous social capital?
Yeah, I mean, that is a brilliant and, of course, important question. I also couldn't help noticing that some of the more successful projects are associated with charismatic individuals. And take someone like Marcus. I mean, could your average kind of politician by numbers get away with any of those interventions? I think they would have been laughed off the block. And it requires, I mean, it does worry me because I think he's absolutely brilliant and he does think about this city in this really crucial way that people never think about the city, actually. But I asked the question in the book, is it replicable? Because, you know, do you have to be the charismatic leader to be able to pull that kind of stuff off? Or I've noticed that people have started using mime artists in I think it was La Paz or something, and it didn't look quite as convincing. And I think probably the most successful holistically project in the book is Medellin, where yes, there's a charismatic politician who goes on to take actually much of the credit for what happens there, but he really doesn't deserve the credit, because what this backs up your point in a sense. What makes that process so successful is it's a kind of engagement by so many different aspects of society. It's, like I say, there is a genuine participative element in the communities involved in the design process of those buildings. And there is politicians working with the architecture schools who have been developing experience in this over a decade, and the business community. And it's very rare to get all of those aspects working together in concert. It's very rare. And that's why Medellin's kind of extraordinary. That's why this term social urbanism really belongs there and emerges there. I can't think of another example. Like many of the other examples are kind of one-offs. I mean, it's also, you could say many of those things about the Tupac Amaru movement, but it relies on a charismatic revolutionary leader. So I'm not sure I can. I'm holding on to Medellin as an optimistic example.
Microphone.
We believe in charismatic leaders at this school, so maybe the question was pointed. Just in terms of letting you speculate on your conclusion of whether this is over or not, and the last images of the fence between North America and South America, it would seem fairly clear that we don't operate on a pure neoliberal economic model, even though that's what's been instituted in the South, and that border is sort of critical to certain kinds of operations. Where we're seeing whole cities built in the 20th century with infrastructure intact, abandoned in the North. I wonder if you would speculate on the disappearance of that fence and what that might imply about the kind of great waste of how capital moves through the globe.
It's the impossible question. I mean, I'm not sure I can do justice to it.
He wants you to solve the problem of Detroit.
I noticed that there are practices of the informal city which are becoming commonplace here in ways that we don't even recognize. So the way that I work, or the way that many of you now work, in a kind of flexi-time, freelance way, with a certain amount of insecurity, possibly like several jobs or projects on at the same time, not the kind of 9 to 5 in the office, you understand, but that other, more flexible way of working that many of us will go on to work in. That is absolutely classic informal economy practice. That is going to become the standard model of post-industrial labor or immaterial labor this century. So already you can see how the capitalist North is adopting the kind of standard practice of the informal city. And I mean, strange things will happen. I mean, look at Torre David. That was totally unpredictable, and yet when you think about it, it's totally logical. And Detroit, I see some kind of similarity there in Detroit. It's like a kind of extrapolated 45-story Detroit in some way, abandoned lots being reused in new ways. I mean, is urban agriculture really the salvation of the future? I have my doubts, to be honest. But something interesting will emerge in Detroit, and then everyone will look back on that as some kind of model which will get rolled out. I just don't know what it is.
I think that's been a very lively conversation, and I think it'd be nice to thank our speaker.